live.
Good morning. Today is Wednesday, February 8th, 2023. This is a meeting of the Senate Natural Resources and Energy Committee. We're continuing our work on Bill S5, the Affordable Heating Act. And today we're hearing from quite a few people bringing in broader voices and perspective to the room. So because we are always tight on time, I'd love to jump in and invite Ms. Judy Dodd to join us at the table, please. And just one quick note, so I know that 15 minutes is a little on the tight side, but we can learn a lot in 15 minutes. So I'll try to help us stay on time so that we can hear from everyone this morning.
Thank you.
Thank you for coming in.
So I am here to represent a perspective of inequities and health issues. And for that reason, I bring my two inhalers to show the impacts of asthma. Thank you for allowing me to speak here today. As a member of the Biomass Task Force, we produced a list of recommendations after listening to at least 12 scientists from Canada, the USA, and Germany. These recommendations were not reviewed by the full Climate Council. They were low-tech and not costly. We had to fight to even get a link included in the Climate Council's annual report. This report did not include costly technology. Look at this list of recommendations, and I've attached them with a footnote. It took a large committee over 10 months to make this list. You must consider everything. Making your decisions wisely is important. Understand that your words and actions will be heard by 3 generations back and 3 generations yet unborn. The science since the arrival of Europeans to this land has always been about supply and demand. If there's a demand, we just let new technology meet that demand. If the demand continues to grow, we'll meet that with new technology. As I hope you can clearly see, this has not worked. It has created huge inequities and has destroyed our land, water, and air. Actually, this philosophy is exactly why we're in the crisis we now have in front of us today. New technology doesn't work, and it's not the answer. There has been little to no balance for a very long time. We cannot continue to let economy rule this land. We will never have a healthy economy if we don't have a healthy land. A healthy land must come before a healthy economy. If we are to survive this crisis, we must change quickly. Time is running out. Ask yourself the equity probing questions that Social Equity Caucus has created. How will the bill provide more equitable and just systems for all Vermonters? I've heard on various recordings from this committee, quote, "What can we do to make these green people happy? Are you kidding me?" The question should be, how can we understand better what these green people know that we don't know? I've also heard Mr. Duvall on these recordings say, quote, "If anyone tells you they don't have a better solution, they are giving you a hollow words." Mr. Duvall's words are all about semantics. Your pattern is to listen to folks from various communities or that work on technology and fuel and have Mr. Duvall explain why what they said was not true or inaccurate. I'm telling you, there's danger in a single story. Mr. Duvall's story is not the only story out there. I worry that you might blindly follow the words of one person. We must be working to break together knowledges, Western science, indigenous science, and green science. You are not doing that with the way S5 is currently written and the way you are projecting change. So please let me give you a plan as I see it, so that you will not think my words are hollow. 1, as it says in the guiding principles for the Climate Council, there must be fairness to all living and non-living things. For instance, land, air, and water are our kin. They must be treated that way. Ask yourself this equity probing question. How does the proposed legislation distribute wealth and resources to increase social well-being for the racial and ethnic groups most adversely impacted? If this bill does not address this, start over and make it so. 2, there must be equity. As it says in the Global Warming Solutions Act, using words like the price will come down or it's getting cheaper is not equitable. It's wishful thinking. Ask yourself the probing equity questions that were developed by the Social Equity Caucus for your use. Which individuals benefit from the proposed bill? Right now, I believe it's the wealthy. If you feel something should be followed up by the PUC, make them follow the equity probing questions as well. Don't use this act of pawning something off as an avoidance to address this crisis. I'm asking you to do what you're supposed to do. Show equity. You represent many different people. Use your position of power respectfully. If the bill has negative impacts on underrepresented groups, you must tell us how these impacts will be mitigated. Where is the bill talking about reducing energy use? We must reduce. I heard you talk about the Navy shower. I put a shutoff valve on my hot water line when my children became teenagers. If the kids were in the shower too long, I simply cut the hot water off. No power, no problem, no argument. I just got out quickly and got used to the showers, cold showers. We need to reduce in every area of our lives. Where are incentives to get people to use less electricity? Simple things like turn the lights off when you leave the room, unplug your charger when not in use, or turn the heat down and put on a damn sweater. I personally set goals for myself to use less kilowatts when compared to the month the previous year. Where are the incentives from electric companies for things like this? Wouldn't it be great if you got a cost reduction every time you use less electricity than the year before? Why is this legislative committee addressing this issue if they do not want to reduce? As a member of the Agriculture and Ecosystem Subcommittee of the Vermont Climate Council, we had many recommendations. Many were not included in the report to the legislature, simply because they were not a shiny new technology. Go back and look at those recommendations, and again, I've attached the link for those. Both the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee of Vermont Climate Council and the Biomass Task Force recommended we do more research on the potential adverse consequence of using wood for heat, including costs to people, air, land, and climate. This has not happened. I would suggest this be a part of S5 before anything else is included. Jared Ulmer from the State of Vermont's Department of Health spoke Friday, January 27th to this committee about reducing home heating. He said, reducing emissions, especially from biomass, is important for good health. Burning biomass releases more greenhouse gases and puts more harmful pollutants into the air than fossil fuels. These recommendations are green, and many do not cost anything. In addition, ask yourself the equity probing question: how does the bill address recovery and repair of broken relationships by dismantling systematic structures that cause harm? Just so you know, in its current state, S5 does not. While on this committee, we asked to increase our scope of work from just biomass to include study of biofuels. We were told no by the Climate Council, yet nobody in the Climate Council or the Ag and Ecosystem Subcommittee addressed biofuels. Could you please tell me why? This must be studied. We cannot include biomass or biofuels to have continued use in our world. They are too destructive. They use too much water. There is a high cost for production, cause industrial pollution, and create a monoculture, cause deforestation, and many more disadvantages. They're simply too hazardous to the land and people. Again, the equity probing question will show you this is not equitable when you ask yourselves, could the bill have desperate negative impacts on marginalized or underrepresented groups? The answer is yes, definitely. So how will you mitigate this? The approximate 4,500 folks living within a 1 mile circle of McNeil generating plant suffer. These are low income people. Many are BIPOC, work 3 to 4 jobs to provide a roof over their head, mostly living in Section 8 housing. Food is hard to come by for these people. They can't imagine having money for a car, or say nothing about an electric car, solar panel, heat pump, or any other new technology that are being promoted. They don't know where their next meal is coming from. They rely on the free and reduced meals at school. I ask you, where is the equity here? Who is going to pick them up and help them through this crisis? It certainly is not S5 the way it is written. They suffer a great deal from pollution in this area and constant hospital visits for COPD and asthma attacks. According to the EPA, the average age in this area for a hospital visit for an asthma attack is a 10-year-old child. Think about this. Imagine if this was your child. The average age of a hospital visit for COPD is a 20-year-old. This is sickening. How can they become productive citizens if we are killing them off with pollution? My family has lived within this circle for generations, and when some moved out of state, their asthma disappeared. Why? The McNeil station is allowed to emit 46.6 tons of fine particle matter, known as particulate matter 2.5, every year. These invisible particles are so small, they lodge deep in the lungs and can then cut into the bloodstream. Exposure and inhalation of particulate matter 2.5 causes premature death, asthma, heart attack, COPD, and a wide range of other illnesses, which is why I brought these inhalers, and I currently have scar tissue on my lungs. In addition, McNeil is permitted to emit hundreds of tons of other health harming pollutants, including sulfur dioxide, carbon monoxide, nitrogen oxide, volatile organic chemicals, and hazardous air pollutants like benzene and formaldehyde, which are known carcinogens. Why then does S5 engage McNeil to expand to produce heat? How does the community around McNeil differ from the averages in Vermont in terms of race, income, and ethnicity? How will our health be disproportionately impacted by S5? How come S5 only looks at greenhouse gas emissions, but makes no consideration of particulate matter 2.5 and other pollutants that is making our community sick? How come there are no doctors or health advocates on the technical assistance group or equity advisor group? Ask yourself these equity probing questions. You'll find the answers if you take the time to dig deep. S5 not only fails to repair or mitigate the harm that has been done to our community, but it completely ignores the fact it will encourage more harmful air pollution. The answer is simple: to phase out biomass burning, as both the Ag and Ecosystem Committee and the Biomass Task Force have recommended. One more equity probing question for you. How will this bill provide for more equity and a just system for all Vermonters? I also serve on the Life Cycle Analysis Committee of the Vermont Climate Council. We've not met many times, nor are the public allowed to view these meetings, or the committee members allowed to meet with ERG and the client, only the Vermont staff. I repeat, we are in a crisis. What the hell is going on? Another probing question here might be, how quickly will the communities most affected by racial and social inequities begin to benefit from the proposed bill? required Efficiency Vermont to stop giving rebates for advanced wood heating and wood stoves. Instead, they should focus on home weatherization, heat pumps, solar hot water, and other approaches that do not generate greenhouse gas emissions and harmful air pollutants. Using wood for heat is not reducing carbon emissions, it's increasing them. This should be a backup only when there is a loss of power, not the main source of heat. They are not counting the carbon emissions from burning the wood. Can we really consider wood renewable in an accepted time frame? Wood is not renewable until you get to the age of the original tree. If you cut down an 80-year-old tree, it will take at least 80 years to offset the greenhouse emissions from cutting and logging that original tree. Logging is a high carbon intensive operation. Creating logging roads, cutting, removing from the forest, transporting and chipping of trees all use fossil fuels. And again, I ask, where is the equity to the land? This is killing the trees, taking away habitat and life cycles for many, not just emitting greenhouse gases into the air. Efficiency Vermont is incentivizing the wrong things. They are creating a bigger problem, and S5 will do the same thing unless biomass and biofuels are slated to be phased out in this bill. The carbon dioxide that is not being counted from the burning wood is called biogenic emission. This burning is currently not being counted in the total amount of greenhouse gases going into the atmosphere. If S5 called for a proper life cycle analysis, the greenhouse gas emissions that requires all biogenic emissions to be counted, you will clearly see the wood burning is destructive. If you continue to burn wood, then climate change will continue to get worse. On paper, it may look better, but in reality, it will be worse until this accounting error is corrected. No more creative math, please. Yet another equity program question. Is the purpose of the legislation to uplift the communities adversely impacted? If so, what evidence has informed this bill of that? Weatherization for both heat and cooling opportunities need to be considered and incentivized to help the low income and elderly. How will the communities be engaged in the evaluation of its success? Many of the people on the Climate Council are representatives of corporations making money off this issue or state employees. I want to thank you for getting diverse perspectives. Now open your mind to their words. And I apologize for having to share everything here that the Just Transactions Subcommittee of the Climate Council should have shared. I repeat, there is danger in this single story, so listen to others. Willie-Oni. I'd be happy to answer any questions that anybody might have.
Sure. So you had mentioned that there's a report, I don't know if it's a formal report or a draft or what, from the, you serve on different committees in the Vermont Climate Council, so I'm not sure I'm going to name the right committee, but there was a report you were referring to that never was issued or it wasn't included in the climate action plan or findings related to it. Can you
Well, there's a
point us to what that might be?
Yeah, I think it's a 393-page annual report that the Climate Council presents to the legislation. So in their last meeting, we had a debate as to whether biomass task force recommendations would be included, because they wanted to just mention, they didn't have time to review it.
Okay.
They didn't want to mention the report. And we argued to at least, at the minimum, put a link to the report so you could read it. So in that annual report is a link to the recommendations from the biomass task force.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing is, thank you for your written testimony. If you can email it to Hayden is helping us here today, but our regular committee is Judith Newman. So if you send it to J. Newman at Ledge State BT US, we'll be happy to put your testimony today up, and I'll track down getting the link to that report. So.
Thank you. Ag and Ecosystems also in the previous year gave a report with similar recommendations, but those recommendations about biomass were also not included in the report the previous year. So you might want to look that up too.
Okay, what was the name of the second one, please?
Ag and Ecosystems Subcommittee. But I have a link on the bottom of my testimony to both of those
Oh, great.
reports.
Okay. Well, thank you. So we'll put those links into our webpage.
Well, that would be great, but it'd be even better if you read them.
Well, I'm assuming people in the committee will chase them down, but I also want to make sure that the public at large who's hearing you speak today will also have a chance to find them. So, thank you.
Thank you.
All right. Well, Senator Corbett?
Yes, Mr. Navy,
What's that?
Mr. Navy. Are you the one that said that the Navy showers?
Oh, yeah, my son was in the Coast Guard. I'm gonna ask this of every witness. Do you have language? We're in the bill writing business. We take the philosophy and we try to make it law.
Mhm.
Okay, so that is done through language in the bill.
Yeah.
What
Well, one thing.
specific amendments you would suggest to the bill?
Well, I don't know if I have specific amendments, but I have specific concerns about language. The word renewable and the word sustainable is used in a cavalier way, and it has different meanings for different people. And so some people may call something renewable, and when you look deeper into the science or the math, it in no way is it renewable, or in no way is it sustainable. So be wise in how you use those two words.
Thank you very much. All right. With that, we'll go on to Mr. Gorelick, Stephen Gorelick. Good morning. From the Fair Hamlet of Walden.
Yes.
A lovely place.
Yes, I don't think most of you know me. My name is Stephen Gorelick, and with Senator Gray says I live in Walden, Caledonia County, Jane Kitchell's district. In the late 1970s, I worked for a solar energy cooperative in California and later ran my own solar energy business. For the past 25 years, I've lived off the grid here in Vermont, using solar for electricity and hot water, and wood for heat. Since 1991, I've worked for a small international nonprofit called Local Futures that focuses on environmental and economic issues. Among other things, I co-authored a report for them following the Paris Climate Conference, arguing for more comprehensive action on the climate front. I think it's safe to say that I'm neither a climate change denier nor a proponent of fossil fuels. Nonetheless, I do not support S5. The Affordable Heat Act and the Global Warming Solutions Act that spawned it is meant to be part of a solution to climate change. Although Jared Duval's later testimony differs on this point, one of the handouts he provided on January 25th shows approximately $7 billion in savings to Vermonters from, quote, avoided social, economic, and environmental damage. I have that graph in the appendix to this if you want to see that.
Thank you. And sorry to interrupt you. Have you sent the committee your electronic?
Yes, I have. But climate change is caused by global emissions, and eliminating Vermont's small contribution to the total won't alter its trajectory. Even if Vermont cut its emissions to zero tomorrow, we would still be saddled with the cost Mr. Duval's handout claimed we will avoid. Rather than pretend that cutting our emissions will have a meaningful impact on climate change, we should anticipate and address the health and environmental impacts we're likely to experience in the coming decades. I'm not saying that we shouldn't take any steps to reduce emissions. We absolutely should. But not to make ourselves feel virtuous or to convince ourselves that we're somehow inspiring others and leading the way to a sustainable future, which is the kind of language one hears around the reasons for doing this. Climate change is clearly a serious threat, but it's unfortunate that so many legislators and environmental groups have latched onto it as though it is the only important environmental problem we face and focus on it in isolation from many other looming crises. Some of those crises have nothing at all to do with climate change. The oceans are filling up with plastics and dead zones. There are carcinogenic forever chemicals in food, water, and soil. Bee populations are crashing. Wilderness is disappearing. The list could go on, but the point is that reducing our emissions won't solve any of these. A single-minded focus on emissions, in fact, can lead to policies that worsen some of those other problems and may even intensify the impacts we're likely to experience from climate change. For example, since extreme weather is likely to be the norm for the foreseeable future, does it make sense to clear cut, blast, and bulldoze our ridgelines for industrial wind turbines, damaging the headwaters of streams and rivers and worsening downstream flooding? With water shortages making it risky to depend on food from drought-prone states like California, does it make sense to cover usable farmland with large-scale PV projects? And with extreme weather making power outages more common, does it make sense for everyone's heating system to depend entirely on electricity? If we focus only on emissions, these projects may make sense, but if we focus on real-world costs and benefits, they don't. I know that the committee would like to know what alternatives I propose. Two answers come to mind. The first is to focus on carbon sequestration in our soils. A study by the Rodale Institute reveals that, quote, global adoption of regenerative practices across both grasslands and arable acreage could sequester more than 100% of current anthropogenic emissions of CO2. Doing so here in Vermont would have the added benefits of reducing pesticide use and strengthening our local food system. We could also encourage woodlands owners to manage their land with carbon sequestration in mind, perhaps giving them financial support for doing so through current use or other programs. Another answer was hinted at by Senator McCormick, who asked Mr. Duvall whether we are doing enough to promote conservation. I'm convinced that we aren't. One reason is that the Climate Council used sector-based rather than consumption-based emissions accounting in its calculations. The implications of this choice are profound. It means that if we consume a product made here in Vermont, we account for the emissions. But if we consume a product made on the other side of the world, the emissions required to produce it and transport it here are ignored. In other words, a head of lettuce grown in Vermont adds to our emissions total, but a head of lettuce shipped here from California doesn't. Look at the shelves of Walmart or Dollar General and all the goods delivered by Amazon, and it's easy to see that there's a lot of consumption happening in Vermont for which there's no emissions accounting. Because Vermont imports so much of what we consume, and because emissions from imports belong to the place that produced them, it appears that consumption has little impact on our emissions total. Not only does this mean there's little incentive for cutting consumption, which is the essence of conservation, it also creates a perverse incentive to replace local production with imports. To see how absurd this is from a policy perspective, consider that Vermont could appear to reduce its emissions just by importing everything we consume, including our food. I think that's worth repeating. Vermont could appear to reduce its emissions just by importing everything we consume. That's in the bizarre world of carbon accounting, but in the real world, does reducing consumption actually reduce emissions? It's helpful to look at a graph of global emissions since 1997, the year the first international treaty to address climate change, the Kyoto Protocol, was signed. Despite all the renewable energy projects that have been installed worldwide and all the hybrid and electric cars that have been put on the roads, emissions have steadily risen year after year. In fact, emissions rose faster in the 2000s than they did in the 1990s. There are, however, two notable exceptions. The first was in 2009 following the global financial crisis, and the second was in 2020 while the COVID pandemic was raging. In both cases, a slowdown in economic activity led to a reduction in global emissions. In other words, encouraging everyone to drive a Tesla is unlikely to reduce emissions, but cutting back on consumption actually would. And unlike a build out of large-scale renewable energy projects, which would have multiple environmental costs here and elsewhere, reducing economic activity would help lessen almost all of our environmental impacts. Perhaps you're thinking that reducing economic activity is simply not an option, that most economists say we need to encourage consumption in order to keep economic growth going. But as economist Kenneth Boulding famously said, the only people who believe you can have infinite economic growth on a finite planet are madmen and economists. It's time for us to envision an economy that doesn't require endless growth, or we will never address the many problems we face, including climate change. In this regard, another recommendation is to fund the annual calculation of Vermont's GPI, or Genuine Progress Indicator. GDP, the most common proxy for economic health, is a simple aggregate of all expenditures. GPI, by contrast, distinguishes between spending on goods and bads. We can't actually say we're doing better as a society if more people are getting cancer and we're spending more money on cancer treatments, or crime is going up and we're having to build more prisons, for example. Both of those things would add to GDP, but not to GPI. Nor can we say that a forest has no value until it is cut down through GDP calculations. An annual calculation of Vermont's GPI was mandated by the legislature in 2012. The funds to implement it have never been allocated. Doing so would give legislators a much better way to know if their policy choices are improving our quality of life, or if they merely stimulate consumption in the false belief that there's a connection between the two. In 2020, per capita personal consumption in Vermont was twice as much as it was in 2000. Is our quality of life today twice as good as it was 20 years ago? Conversely, would our lives be appreciably worse if we only consumed at the rate we did in 2020? As a longtime resident of the Northeast Kingdom, I know how a lot of my friends and neighbors see the emissions reduction work of the legislature. Most are low-income working people who don't live extravagantly, and yet they feel that Montpelier is, in effect, blaming them, along with their fossil fuel furnaces and their 20-year-old cars and pickup trucks, for climate change. I'm not saying they're right or wrong for thinking that way. I'm just telling you how they feel. And I think if you talk to Jane Pitchell, she'll confirm this. But it's undeniable that the push for electrification is coming from more urbanized, more populous parts of Vermont, while the biggest renewable energy projects have been in the most rural parts of the state, along with the state's only landfill, where all our personal consumption eventually goes to die. It's also true, as a 2021 report confirmed, that the biggest contributors to climate change worldwide are the wealthy, a class the report defines as the polluter elite. My neighbor in a double wide is not dumb. He knows that whatever emissions he produces are a small fraction of what a wealthy homeowner on Shelburne Bay produces, even if their mansion and swimming pool are heated with renewable electricity. Instead of using market forces on a huge scale in order to impel Vermonters to electrify home heating, why not use those same forces to encourage conservation? Perhaps there's no economic incentive that will wean Vermont's wealthiest from their extravagances, but the stigma of being labeled as among the polluting elite might rein in their worst excesses. To conclude, I agree with a sentiment expressed more than once during these hearings. Taking action in response to climate change is a moral imperative. Reducing consumption may not be politically popular, but it's the only path towards really addressing the many environmental problems we face, including climate change. Aside from some efforts at weatherization, S5 does little to reduce home heat energy consumption and nothing at all to reduce consumption more broadly. And I do appreciate the hard work the committee has put into the Affordable Heat Act, but I sincerely hope that you'll decide to move in a different direction. Thanks.
Thank you, Senator White. And I'm going to limit our debate time or discussion time just because we have a lot of people here from this meeting.
Thank you, Chairman Bright. Just one brief question, which is, do you have a recommended metric or life cycle analysis that is currently available that we could use to capture the macroeconomic concerns that you have?
I don't personally have it. I know that the state of Oregon they were doing sector-based emissions accounting. And either they or a nonprofit recalculated based on consumption-based emissions, and it was 50% higher with consumption-based.
Okay, I would love to see what the metric was that they used, because I have been very attuned to this concern. I'm not aware of an actual metric or tool that we can use to address the concerns that have been raised. So thank you. And if you have one, send it.
I will.
Thank you very much.
Quickly,
One,
I'm sorry.
to the point of, I know that the theme is consumption, and I'd say for people listening, they may want to go back to our testimony in week 1 from John Erickson, who is one of the world's leading ecological economists. So I think we started out with an awareness of sort of the trap of just planning quote unquote good growth. So people may find this testimony interesting. The other thing is also by way of reassurance to people in the audience, this committee has worked on all the issues you mentioned. So PFAS exposure, reduction in plastics, other toxins in the environment. So it's not a defensive remark, just that I want people to know that we look at our job more comprehensively than just addressing this particular climate bill. So Sarah McCormick, one to you, and then we're going to move on.
Do you have language?
I don't have language that would plug in easily into the bill as it exists, but I would, it wouldn't hurt to include something about funding the GPI calculations so that you have a better way of monitoring the impact of this and other legislation. I'm not sure if Mr. Erickson that you referred to, is he at UBM and the Ecological Economics Department?
He's with the Gund Institute.
The Gund Institute is the one who is going to calculate GPI.
Yeah, thanks. And while you're mentioning it, they have taken models from elsewhere on GPI and then applied it to Vermont in particular. So there's some really interesting information exactly along the lines they're speaking about. Okay, with that, we could go to Ms. Dispassi. Did I get that right?
Yes, thank you so much. Hello, everybody. I have a slide presentation that I want to hand around to you guys if possible. I'll let that go around first. Sorry for the paper. I always feel bad, but I feel like it's nice to have a hard copy to go through. So my name is Allison Despathy, and thank you so much for having me, Chairman Bray, Senator McDonald, Senator White, Senator McCormick, and Senator Watson. It's really a pleasure to be here, and I appreciate the opportunity. I've been watching this closely over the past few years, and I just want to sort of preface with anything that I say right now is absolutely not a personal attack. You guys are working so hard. Well, there's just some different ideas I have to share. You guys are working so hard, and I really appreciate the work you're doing. I know this is a work in progress. I know you're trying to pull together a lot of different areas to come together with the best plan. And as you say, Chairman Bray, I've heard you say it multiple times, and I think it's a perfect visual, is the path. What is the best path? Not just here in committee on this bill, but in general for Vermont, from a sustainability and environmental, journey for us, so to speak. So the first thing that I would say, just a little bit of background. I have an undergraduate degree. I started studying cultural anthropology, and I combined it with plant biology and environmental horticulture. I was able to go to Australia, and I was able to study with Aboriginal people in Tiwi, which is 2 islands off North Territory of Australia. Basically, what I was able to take in from them was relationships with the land, What are people's relationships with the land? How do we work with the land? We, as you guys all know, are nature, right? We're totally tied and connected to the land. And resonance wise, like this is kind of interesting. I think we all know that we feel good in nature. The alpha waves in our brain are 7.83 hertz. The Schumann's resonance waves, the resonance of the earth is 7.83 hertz. So literally we are connected with the earth. So when we talk about sustainability, we talk about environmentalism, and Senator McCormick, this goes to the question that you had of the language, right? What is real sustainability? How do we get there? We don't want corporate industry-driven environmental solutions. We need real solutions that work specifically here in Vermont, because as you all know, we're a really unique state. We have so many people working so hard for the land, for the environment, for conserving. What can we do renewable-wise? I do have a lot of options for you that I didn't bring up in particular. Okay, so just my background, I've been looking at relationships between people and land for a long time, looking at how do we incorporate indigenous wisdom and use that as our guide to really get to the answers that we need to get to for Vermont, for our world. I also then went on when I saw the relationship and really started to look at the philosophy of people and their relationship to land, and I ended up with a degree in clinical human nutrition because I feel that it really is what connects people directly to their land and how we take care of our land and our resources. I've had a nutrition practice in St. Johnsbury for 20 plus years. I work at the Vermont State Colleges teaching nutrition as well. In the 20 years that I've lived in the Northeast Kingdom in Danville, I have worked so hard. It has been top priority for me to try to connect people with local food systems, to connect people with grass-fed food and local farms and CSAs, right? That helps our economy, it helps our environment, it helps the health of the people, right? So we know that interaction, and all of you are in here, you know the systems thinking, right? When we talk about environmentalism, we have to link it all together. It is all tied in. Ag ties in, resources tie in, water, what you guys are trying to do here. So
just give a quick note.
yes,
So I'm noticing
yeah,
we have 38 slides.
it'll
And
cruise.
well, we
If
won't
you-
be able to go through them all. I think I'd ask you to be
I'll
selective.
pick and choose totally, I promise. Okay, so I just want to acknowledge, I know you guys are tasked with solving and serving. You guys are elected by your constituents. You take an oath to not do anything injurious. You're here because you want to serve the people, but you also have the toughest problems to solve. So I totally respect and recognize what you guys are doing. And I know that you're contending with different ideologies. I know you've got industry coming in on one side of we got to do this is the answer, here it is. And then you've got other people coming in saying, no, just slow down, don't do it, etc. Let it unfold. So you've got battling information, right, that you're trying to contend with. So trying to understand what I get from you guys is, okay, you have goals. Greenhouse gas emissions, obviously per the Global Warming Solutions Act, but I also have heard you guys say, and I respect this a lot, is we don't want dependence on the volatile fossil fuel industry, right? That's like another driving force. We don't want to be dependent on that world. So with that in mind, I would also say that in general, a lot of Vermonters have that mentality. We don't want dependence. We don't want dependence on the oil. We don't want dependence just on the electricity. Like we want to have our backup. My husband and I, every year when we go into winter, we grow like 60% of our food. We've got an acre farm. We've got a big greenhouse. Do we have enough food? Do we have the wood that we need? We spend a lot of money on an efficient wood stove so we could do our hot water and our heat. So people, this is like a Vermont mentality, right? So this is also where I think you run into, people aren't going to necessarily want to lock into electric's my thing, because we start seeing the weather, we see the storms going on, we see, can we trust that? Do we trust that? There's like a real sort of innate issue with, do we trust that? So I think then it comes to, are heat pumps, for example, just a supplemental system? Are people going to invest in a heat pump as if it can't be their main system and it's not suggested to be their main system? So the big thing as a starting point on the beginning of these is you guys took testimony from the fuel dealers. And I literally watched that 3 times and they almost brought me to tears because these guys have been in there on the ground doing the work that you guys are trying to sort of now come in and say, we need to monitor it, we need to measure it, we want to keep track of it, we want to have credits, we want to make this whole sort of system of it, right? But they've been doing the work for like 12, 13 years. I mean, you heard Stanger, right? They put him in there. Yeah, Stanger's like 1,000 heat pumps a year that he's been putting in for 12, 13 years. they're doing the work. That's the thing. I'm just gonna jump to his quote that I had in here. This is like one of the things that really I think is a problem, is that you guys seem to be putting all of the pressure on this industry to solve the problem. And it's talked about that this bill is equitable. And again, this is nothing personal. It's a work in progress, I respect. But you're talking about it as equitable. We're going to take care of low income. We're going to take care of moderate income. You have people coming in saying we need to insure 16%, 16%. But what about the fuel dealers? What about them, right? And so they're doing the work for all this time. Does any of the work they did in the past 13 years, is that ever going to count for anything now that we're deciding to measure it? Now that we're deciding to come in and regulate it and sort of turn it into a credit system? And it's a carbon credit system, right? I mean, that's literally the base metric is carbon. Call it what you want, clean heat standard, credit, etc. But the base metric is carbon. And so I was listening to these guys and I'm just like listening to them again and again. And I hear Stenger, and he goes, you can't heat the average home in Northeast with electricity. He's been doing renewable propane, cold climate heat pumps, hybrid electric hot water heaters. Biodiesel obviously has issues, but he's been doing the work. So all of a sudden it's like the state is sort of giving the PUC, we're going to come in and we're going to now regulate this. We want to count it, we want to measure it, it has to be worth something. You guys need to pay us money, you're probably going to have to charge your consumers. We're not quite sure what the numbers are going to be yet, but this is how we're going to do it now. So I think a fundamental question as a baseline is, has there been a baseline analysis and report done to assess current and recent actions? What have all of these companies been doing for 12, 13 years when I didn't even know what a fuel efficient or clean heat pump was? I had no clue. And then Stanger's talking about Arctic ones, and I looked up the Arctic ones, and it's like, oh, they get to -20. That could maybe be something in Vermont. Is it accessible? How much is it? Is there going to be funding for it? Who's going to take it up? Especially if it's just a supplemental system. If it's just a supplemental system, some people are going to do that because most people in Vermont want to do what's best for the environment. Pretty much all of us have that in us. Like, we want to do what's best. You guys are trying to forge the path for what is best. How do we do this? Dennis Percy, Fred's Energy, he's over my way. My suggestion, his quote, my suggestion to fix the problem, instead of pushing all this money towards heat pumps, give some incentives to put more efficient heating systems in. That was his quote. So I would say he talked about in there, he said, we had a house that was using 2,000 gallons of fuel. We put an efficient heat pump in, we got it down to 1,000. That's massive. He was able to chop their consumption by half with an efficient heating system, he said. And it may still have been fossil fuel, which in your guys' eligible measures, you guys say it can't swap one fossil fuel for another in the bill. But what I'm wondering is, in the eligible measures, if you're going to move this thing through, could you put in an efficient heat system? That could be an easy adjustment where not only are you reducing consumption, but you're allowing the fuel dealer to really work with their customer and say, what is the best scenario for your house? What do you have? Do we need to weatherize? To really just give them an option. I feel like that should be a consideration. I'm going to backtrack for 1 second. So from a sustainability ethics standpoint, this is on if you have any interest. This is on page 7, or slide 7, I should say. So ethics and sustainability. So we've got social, environmental, and economic. And if you look at how they overlap, we want to cover all of them. So you guys obviously have had a focus on environmental. This is like your driving force, right? Because of the big sort of uproar last year on biofuel and pricing, you guys have now pulled in a little bit of equity, right? You're like saying like, this is equitable, we're going to help low income, moderate income, etc. Again, I would say you're doing it on the backs of the fuel dealers who have been doing this work forever. For generations, they have been trying to bring efficient, environmental, and economical heating systems to the people in their communities. The other thing I would say is most of them, if you go around in your communities, you see like Fred's Energy. They're like, paying money for local schools, for uniforms, for teams, for ice rinks. So now there's going to be money taken from them out of the community. Maybe they don't have enough money to dedicate into the community anymore because now they have to pay for these credits or pay a non-compliance fee. And it just doesn't seem ethical when you talk about there's no real numbers. You could say Julie Moore 70 cents, you could say other people's 10 or 20 cents. Where are the numbers for people to work with? These fuel dealers like Haskins is like, I don't know what to say, I'm gonna have to close. Like I'm gonna have to shut down because I don't have something to work with. Can you imagine working under that stress? Like what's that gonna look like? And that's the other thing too, is if the PUC is deciding, I think the check back got taken out, right? You guys had like a real check back with a vote last year. I think, am I correct in saying that there's no vote now?
There was not a vote there's no vote in this. There's a vote on the bill.
Mhm.
There's not a revote on the bill.
That's what I thought last year, there was a revote, yeah. So basically, that's the other thing, is like having a true check back with a vote, so that could be evaluated. What did the PUC just put together, you know? And obviously there were caps. I know in New Mexico, they had put like a short circuit. So basically, if you have an unreasonable cost impact that comes back from the PUC, can you put like a short circuit amendment in there and just say, if it's past this amount, we're not gonna do it? I think that would offer, like, basically, the fuel dealers and the people need some protections in place. And right now, this bill doesn't offer any protections. And I know the hope is that the PUC is going to, you know, put the plan together, but then for you guys to be able to come back and actually vote and agree upon it, I think would be ethical for people. The other thing that's tricky, just back to the fuel dealers, this is a quote from the Public Service Department. However, this move to electrification technologies is not a government mandate and is dependent on customers choosing electric vehicles over traditional cars and/or choosing to install cold climate heat pumps or advanced wood heating to reduce the use of heating oil and propane. For most customers, these choices are informed not only by environmental considerations, but also by economics. So basically, these fuel dealers are now completely at the whims of who chooses and wants to do this. Do they have to advertise? Do they have to market? Do they have to push clean heat pumps on someone when that's not really going to be what's appropriate for this person's house? You know, what position does that put the fuel dealer in when they have no clue? Sure, I'll pay the fee and not play this game. They can sort of opt out. What's that fee gonna be? How much money does it take from them and their communities? Or do they take the risk and go, all right, let's see if I can pull these credits together, or I pay a triple non-compliance charge to default delivery because I didn't make it happen. Like, that's just a game that they're being forced into that has no ethics around it because they don't have any clear rules. And I know you're saying they'll have clear rules, but it's still putting it on the fuel dealers, which I feel like it just really needs to be revisited. So just jumping ahead, again, all of the fuel dealers were like, don't remove the fossil fuel system. These are supplemental at this point. You need to keep that in play. Who's going to take that on? That's a roadblock for many people. Already dealing with, can I weatherize my house, and dealing with the mandates and all of those things, that's a lot of time. Can somebody take this upon themselves? The other quick things that I just wanted to hit on, and I have in there, you guys specifically say section 5, S5, equitable. It needs to do this equitably. And it also talks about on the workforce. It's not just on those who are low income or moderate income. We have to be looking at what are we doing to the workforce? They're doing the work and now we're forcing them into this game. And that I feel like is an issue. I do have some pictures on carbon sequestering that was mentioned by Steve. Have you guys ever seen mycorrhizae fungus?
Yes.
Yeah. It's super infinite, right? It's infinite. It can keep growing. This is the best carbon sequestration ever. If you are a farmer, if you grow food, if you walk in the forest, you see mycorrhizae. We have 75% forest in Vermont. We've got massive, massive carbon sequestering going on. I have a list of what's happening for carbon sequestering. Unfortunately, dairy farms are closing, grass-fed farms are on the rise, grass-fed beef farms are on the rise. Those sequester carbon. I'm connecting people with food all the time. We've got more and more dairies who are moving from grain to totally grass-fed. I work closely with Steve Brown in East Burke. He said he went to the conference with all the farmers and he was heartbroken watching what they pay for grain because of chain supplies and fuel, et cetera. So there's a lot going on in Vermont that sequesters carbon naturally. There's a lot of links in there. I did want to talk about the greenwashing piece.
Can I ask you to try to wrap up in the next 2 minutes?
Yeah.
Because every time we go along, we cut somebody off.
I
Someone else will
know.
not get it.
And the first person went a little bit longer. If I could just
Right.
ask for
So
5,
it's a
I'll be quick.
snowballing thing. So
Okay, I
let's
know it is
all
a
stick
snowballing
to
thing.
our
Yeah.
lanes on this.
So I just wanted to talk about with the financialization and commodification of nature. We're playing this carbon game, and the PUC had approved a 14.5 million, right? You guys probably saw that. They just bought like toxic landfill biogas from New York, sent it around pipes, and in order to gain a bunch of credits that they could sell to Oregon and California. Is that real environmental solutions? It absolutely is not a real environmental solution. And you see the Nature Conservancy is jumping in with this entire game as well. So the Nature Conservancy, world's biggest environmental group, dealer of meaningless carbon offsets to BlackRock, to JP Morgan. We're gonna go give money to this land. We just got all the carbon from it. So we're totally financializing and commodifying nature. The other thing that you probably saw going around is this year, the Family Forest Carbon Program in Vermont. Again, let us give you a little bit of money so we can have the carbon for your forest, and then we're gonna sell it off to the companies so they can have carbon offsets. This is what we're doing with measuring carbon. I had info in here about biofuels, and we keep talking first generation, second generation, third generation biofuels. This is like massive pesticides. I know there was a comment, I think it was maybe from you, Senator White, where you said that if we have more demand for biofuel, we're gonna have more of a supply, it's gonna come in, but at what cost? We are clearing forests in third world countries. It's environmental colonialism. We are mining, we are clearing, we are adding pesticides, we are poisoning their water so that we can have biofuel. And that literally is first generation, second generation, you're still totally clearing, third generation, you're talking GMO algae with all the biotech issues that come with that. If I had more time, I could get into it. I've been fighting biotech for a long time as a nutritionist. The PFAS, 2 things just quick to say about that, and then I'll wrap up. The town of Avon, New York, July 2021, they enacted a local law to prohibit using solar panels that contain PFAS in them. That's not something we've looked at, but we do have 2 bills in the House here from Representative Carrie Dolan, and she is looking to minimize and get PFAS out of Vermont by 2030. They are in windmills, they are in certain solar panels. They are also, just yesterday I saw, where was that? Oh yeah, European Union. The European Union Chemicals Agency, literally just yesterday proposed a ban on PFAS. They're going for it. This is like a really big thing. This is also going to impact heat pumps because they have, we call that stuff, the antifreeze in it. So it's all sort of coming together. Like we have to be aware of that trajectory. What do we want to see happen with GMOs in the world? What do we want to see happen with PFAS in the world? Like we have to look at toxicity issues, and we can't just border off ourselves and say, we're doing equity in Vermont. How does all of this decision impact the rest of the country, impact the rest of the world when we're spraying glyphosate, we're spraying pesticides, we've got hypoxic zones down in the Gulf of Mexico because of all the Midwest runoff. So tons more in here. I know, I'm just gonna go to my last few pages.
We really need to stop if you have
I just,
one
like
more.
this last minute, this is like my plans.
Okay.
Solution number 1, at a minimum.
So it's a little disrespectful to everyone who comes after when people continue.
I know, I'm so sorry, but am I been past 15 minutes? I don't think so. I thought I had 15. I don't think I am. I know you're trying to rush me through because you got to get to everyone. This is my last thing. Solution number 1, please provide caps with a short circuit amendment. Prohibit and define unreasonable impacts in the bill. True legislative check back with a vote. Protections for the obligated entities. You need to ensure that the fuel dealers do not have any business closures. They should not have to close their business because you decide to put this on them with this plan. No out-of-state purchase of carbon credits. That makes 0 sense. A fuel dealer should not have to buy carbon credits on the market, wherever those carbon credits came from, in order to keep their business going and not have a non-compliant state. And please add in the efficient heating systems as an eligible measure. They are reducing consumption. That's huge. Solution 2, better than a minimum. The state pulls itself out. Forge a relationship between Efficiency Vermont and the Vermont fuel dealers. All of the actions in play. Fuel dealers are doing the work. Efficiency Vermont is doing the weatherization. Money is coming in. 59 million, did Efficiency Vermont say? is coming in, right, from the Inflation Reductions Act. That's a ton of money. They're gonna be so held up trying to figure out how to get that money to people. Can the state remove itself back for a little bit, monitor the situation, let this money be used? Like that could be a really real solution with where to focus efforts, time, and energy. Leave out the PUC. Obviously, it would require legislative action to prevent a lawsuit. But Mark Higley, as a representative, has a bill in place for that. And then I would just say on the last one, and thank you, I'm so sorry, I don't know if I've been over 15 minutes, local and regional plan. We have to look at addressing localized energy burdens, grid access, output capability, rates, and infrastructure. We can break this up into localized areas with fuel dealers and Efficiency Vermont. There's a better, more Vermont-centric way to do this that is not destructive and will not damage the businesses and put more financial burden on the people. And people want to do what's right. This is my last sentence. People in the state want to do what's right. They love the environment. And I know that you guys do here and you're trying to figure it out. We just have to make sure that people don't take a hit. We have to make sure that it's not a destructive plan. So
Thank you very much.
thank you. Sorry to run through.
Okay. So with that, I'd like to go to with the Partnership for Policy Integrity, who's joining us remotely. If you can stick to a 15-minute time frame, that will be helpful to our work this morning.
Of course. Thank you, Chairman Bray. Can you hear me all right?
Yes, thank you.
Okay, excellent. So I'm going to need to share my screen. My name is Laura Height. I'm the U.S. Policy Director for the Partnership for Policy Integrity. I want to thank you for this opportunity to testify remotely today. And I am going to now offer some specific comments on the legislation, but a little bit of overview about biomass, because I think there's a lot of confusion. I understand why on the impacts in terms of greenhouse gas accounting. So let me see if I can do this. I'm not the most technology savvy person, but let's see.
He's set up to share a screen now.
I'm going to hit the share screen. And now I'm going to go into my PowerPoint. Is that working?
Yep, we can see it. Thank you.
Yes. All right. So far, so good. Okay, so we've gone through this screen. We have, some specific thoughts on S5. I should go back to say that Partnership for Policy Integrity was founded in 2010 in Massachusetts to combat industry disinformation about biomass energy and to advocate for scientifically sound public policy. So we've reviewed a lot of proposals over the years, and the most glaring omission that I found in S5 is the absence of any health-based standards. And I think it's important to remind folks about Jared Ulmer's presentation, where he said that Vermonters experience an estimated 100 to 240.
Please continue. Thank you.
Oh, no, I think she froze.
Oh, sorry. I thought it was a pause because I was checking in with data. Ms. Height, I don't know if you
both residential wood heating and from biomass power plants.
She probably doesn't know that we lost.
Right.
Can you hear me all right?
Yes. Well, we're cutting in and out,
Oh,
so.
no. Well, you have my slides, if worse comes to worse.
She shuts off her own video of herself.
Yeah.
Oh, I could do that. Yeah, why don't, but wouldn't that shut off my screen?
Oh.
Let me see.
If you just turn off your.
Excellent. Oh, gosh. You guys are great. Thank you. There goes another minute of my time. I hope this works better. Again, this is called the Affordable Heat Act, and I think we need to really factor in issues of health impacts, because if Jared Ulmer's estimates are accurate, that biomass emissions account for $100 to $240 million a year in estimated health impacts, then you really need to be looking at ways to reduce emissions of particulates and other matters, other emissions from burning wood. I'll go further into these other recommendations as I go forward. Let me just move on. So just in basics on the biomass emissions, the industry, and you've seen this chart before because it's in the VEIC report, this nice, lovely theory that, the biomass carbon cycle, the trees get burned, but then new trees grow and take back those emissions. Well, that sort of overlooks the fact that there's a lag time, of often in excess of 100 years, or certainly decades before that happens. And quite frankly, we don't have that amount of time to reduce emissions. The IPCC says we have to really slash emissions in the next 10 years. In reality, biomass energy is sort of a double whammy because not only are you emitting a large pulse of carbon into the air when you burn the wood, but you're also reducing the forest capacity to sequester those carbon emissions. So that's why you have the highest CO2 concentrations when you're moving into a scenario where you're burning biomass for energy. Wood burning power plants, apologize because you probably have seen all this before, emit more CO2 per megawatt hour than coal or gas-fired plants. And what I wanted to get to was, the Massachusetts study, which was in 2010, that the state of Massachusetts commissioned, shows that it takes over 90 years for electricity plant that burns biomass to even reach parity with the emissions from that a natural gas plant would burn. Now, thermal is more efficient, but it all depends on the efficiency of that plant. I'm going quickly because I'm hoping there'll be time for questions. I've been really astonished by what I've been reading in Vermont. I'm afraid to say, and I don't mean to be disrespectful, but Vermont is still back in 2008 in terms of understanding the issue of greenhouse gas accounting. And I just want to clarify that the IPCC has never said that biomass energy is carbon neutral. EPA has never said that biomass energy is carbon neutral. And in fact, the IPCC, and I don't have time to explain this, goes on to explain that the neutrality perception is linked to a misunderstanding of the guidelines for greenhouse gas inventories. So we can chew on that for a while. I'd be happy to answer questions or provide more information to the committee. I was trying to figure out how to do the fade effect, but I didn't. So looking at McNeil, the VEIC life cycle analysis assessment, which I would not consider a life cycle analysis, only looked at the fossil fuel emissions, both the upstream emissions from the harvesting, the production, and the transportation, and the fossil emissions from the burning, comes up with 16,393 metric tons, and voila, this amazingly low greenhouse gas emissions of 0.07 metric tons per megawatt hour. But they didn't count the emissions from burning wood, which, as you can see, completely dwarfs the fossil emissions and is a much higher emissions rate. And this is standard. I mean, McNeil is not any dirtier than any other 50 megawatt standard biomass power plant. They're typically 3 to 4 times more polluting than natural gas. So McNeil operates at about 26% efficiency, meaning that most of the energy content of the wood fuel is wasted and goes up the stack. Now, this is, again, that's standard, that's industry average for a biomass electricity plant. It's simple physics. Wood chips are inherently inefficient to burn. It's a 45% moisture content means that a lot of the energy is spent just boiling off the water. By comparison, the average US coal fleet efficiency is 33%, and an average natural gas efficiency is 43%. Every ton of wood, that is just in a biomass plant like McNeil emits about a ton of CO2 emissions. And there's no realistic means to reduce stack CO2 emissions other than improving plant efficiency. And if you want to be as efficient as possible with your use of wood, which I hope you are, you would be looking at the most efficient technologies available, which is combined heat and power plants. They have the most efficient use of fuel. A natural gas combined heat and power plant typically achieves 65 to 80% efficiency. So let's go to the next slide. And that's what's being done. Massachusetts in 2012, for their renewable portfolio standard, required that plants would have to meet a 60% or higher overall efficiency. DC did the same thing in 2015, only they went to 65% efficiency. And the Clean Future Act, it's federal legislation, which ended up not being adopted, went with greater than 60%. That's your way to, PFBI, would recommend not allowing combustion-based district heating to be allowed in S5. But if you are going to, you should at least make it comparable to an average natural gas, the natural gas CHP plant, or at least make it as efficient as possible. I think that's reasonable language to add. But I don't think efficiency is the only thing to be looking at. Very significant health impacts from burning biomass, pretty much worse across the board than coal, other than sulfur dioxide. Again, I'm sort of zipping through here. And as you know, the McNeil plant is in an area that has, very high environmental justice population compared to the rest of Vermont. And if you look at the air pollution in Winooski, it's high. So I've heard the argument, and it's true, that the biomass power plant will have much more significant emissions control devices than your average residential wood heater or smaller wood boiler. But there's still an overall pulse of emissions. It's a point source. They're permitted to emit up to 46 tons of PM 2.5 per year, and that's going to be impacting the local community the hardest. So there really is a disproportionate impact, an equity impact with regard to the pollution loading. I'm going to skip over all of the information about wood heating. You've heard this before, and again, go back to Jared Ulmer. This is a big cost. It's not affordable to be losing time from work, to having to go to the doctors, to losing time from your life because of high pollution loads. And really, you need to not just look at greenhouse gas emissions, but also the other pollution emissions. I'm afraid I've lost track of time, so I'm just going to keep on zipping through clearly as quickly as possible. With the advanced wood heating, this legislation really has no criteria at all. I think that it would be really helpful to contact the folks at NESCAM. That's the Northeast, I meant to spell it out. It's the Association of Air Quality Managers from multiple states, including Vermont, has done a lot of research on why EPA's certification programs are not effective. And I want this committee to know that there are going to be some new rules coming out in the coming year too. The EPA is working on new source performance standards for advanced wood heaters. And the EPA is also looking at strengthening the emissions standards for fine particulate matter, which haven't been updated since about 2012, I think. So there's a lot in play here, and I think you want to make sure that you really are only incentivizing those wood heating systems that are the cleanest from a health perspective, as well as from a greenhouse gas perspective, or maybe more from the health perspective. Anyway, I really recommend consulting NESCAM on this, and there's a link to this report on this on this PowerPoint slide. Now, as an example, Massachusetts developed when we passed our alternative energy, when we added renewable thermal technologies. And when I say we, it's because PFBI is based in Massachusetts, and we worked on both the legislation and the regulations. But when we added renewable thermal technologies into our alternative energy portfolio standard, which was designed for actually efficiency, they added all of these things for eligible biomass, biogas, and liquid biofuel. They had to have emissions performance standards that are protective of public health, life cycle greenhouse gas emissions and counting that includes biogenic emissions, and only high efficiency best-in-class technologies can qualify. So our specific recommendations with regard to markups to S5, and I'll be submitting a red line later today, would be to actually add protect public health to the legislative intent, require assessment of criteria emissions, and add public health professionals to the tag and the EAG. Really prioritize eligible measures 1 through 6. I mean, our preference would be only have those for the first stage, but those are the ones that are not going to be adding to your pollution load. Delay inclusion of advanced wood heating until these new standards are issued. Consult with NESCAM. They're your resource. There's somebody in Vermont, who you can reach out to. I can send you some reports. And then on the eligible district heating surfaces, again, my organization would recommend removing combustion-based renewable energy entirely. But if you are going to proceed with that, at least require such facilities to be at least 60% efficient. And then in terms of the GHG modeling that you mentioned in the bill, the GREET model is not appropriate. There is no IPCC model. That was kind of puzzling. And I mean, there are most of the studies now that have life cycle analysis do include biogenic fuels, just not in Vermont. So there's plenty of things you can look at, but I think the statute should specify that you do want to include biogenic fuel emissions. So I don't know where I'm at with time. I had a few more slides just with some examples. They're in your packet, but maybe I should just stop here. And if you have questions, I can answer them.
Sure, thank you. And thank you for your PowerPoint. So we have hard copies for the committee, and it's also posted to our website so that people who are watching and interested can see the very same thing. And thank you too for including specific recommendations on your last slide for considerations as we're moving towards markup. Is there a committee question? Senator McCormick.
I understand the argument you make that biofuels are not really renewable, sustainable. The argument that's often made to us is not quite that ambitious, that they're actually green fuels, but that they're the lesser of evils, and that we really don't have the capacity to simply go carbon-free immediately, that we need a transition, and that's the argument made for the natural gas and for wood chips and so on. It's the lesser of evils and provides a backup for the inadequacies of the genuinely green technology. Would you comment on that?
Yes, thank you. That is a great question. There's no question we need to move away from all carbon fuels. All carbon, we have a global crisis. It's the crisis of our lifetime, and the planet's, major concern is climate change. And there's two things going on. One, we need to reduce carbon emissions significantly and quickly. And two, we need to do as much as we can to pull down the atmospheric levels of greenhouse gases as efficiently and effectively as we can. Trees are an important part of both sides of that equation because one, burning them is far more polluting in terms of the pulse of CO2 that goes into the atmosphere than burning fossil fuels. And on the other side, you need our trees and our forest ecosystems to absorb and sequester and store that carbon. So there's no question that biomass burning is far worse than fossil fuels. And they're certainly for the next century. And so why would we want to be incentivizing anything that's worse than the worst fossil fuel? If biomass is worse than coal in terms of both GHG emissions and all the other air pollution emissions, why would you want to include that in any sort of a clean heat or clean energy program? So, I mean, Not that we're supporting continued use of fossil fuels, but we would recommend, McNeil should be phased out. It shouldn't be expanded and allowed to continue in perpetuity. We want to build up more of the clean renewables to offset those emissions, the power that's on the grid now.
Be brief, please.
Okay. Robert Frost described rotting as slow fire. The argument is made that the carbon cycle, the carbon goes, if it either because it's burned or because the tree falls into the ground, it rots eventually. The carbon goes up, it rains down, it's a carbon cycle, and then all the burning wood products does is speed up the cycle, but it doesn't actually add aggregate carbon to the atmosphere. Would you comment on that?
Yeah, I thank you. That's another great question. I mean, my organization, our director Mary Booth wrote an article that was published, which I'll share with you, just comparing burning residues, not even whole trees that were logged specifically for energy, with the alternative, which is what would happen otherwise. So of course, what would happen otherwise is it would be, in most cases, lying on the ground, slowly rotting. Well, in Vermont, with a cold climate, that could take, centuries, decades at least, to centuries for that rotting to occur. And it doesn't all go up into the atmosphere. A lot of it is incorporated into the soils, into the fungi, into the roots, into new plants. So this idea that all of the carbon is going to be going straight into the atmosphere is false. And certainly on a time scale that we're looking at, it's very dangerous to accelerate the use of biomass.
Thank you.
The only exception in her article, the net emissions inventory is like, what if you don't use it for energy, what would be the counterfactual? The only exception, and this is just ours, the Canadian Forest Service, Lagunier has done a lot of research, and they use the same approach that we did, which is, what's the alternative now? The alternative is if it was going to be burned anyway. So a lot of the biomass energy in the US comes from in industrial sites where pulp and paper mills will burn their black liquor. Well, if you're going to burn the black liquor anyway, you might as well get the energy from it. There's no real net change. But if the alternative is to lie in the forest and decay, especially northern forests, hardwoods, cool temperatures, that's going to be centuries.
Senator White.
Thank you, Chair Bray. Who funds your organization?
We're funded by a number of private foundations, donors.
Okay.
I'm sorry, we're completely nonprofit. I should have mentioned we're a nonprofit organization.
Okay, I'm having trouble finding information about your funding source, and I'm wondering if perhaps you could follow up over an email or direct me to a link on your website.
Oh, sure. I think on our website, if you find our 10-year report, there should be that information. And if not, I'm happy to share with you who our funders are.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. So you mentioned reports that you thought we might want to take a look at. So if there's anything that you feel, in addition to your PowerPoint, that would be helpful, please send along to the committee. And we will get that to committee members as well as put it on our website as a resource to the public at large.
Okay, thank you very much. And I appreciate all the hard work this committee has done over the past 2 years on this legislation. I hope there's still time to make some adjustments to help improve the quality of life for Vermonters.
Thank you, Ms. Height. Now we're going to move on to Ms. Standard. So as you can see, we have
No time.
well, we've run long, and that's.
I invite everyone to stand up and stretch while I'm selling.
So let me jump ahead with Professor Howard connecting at 10:15. So we can either ask you to use 18 minutes now, or you could start your testimony and come back. I don't want us to have appointment crashing into appointment, which is what happens when people run long. And I'm loath to ever cut people off. but it's a balance between how long and having hearing from everyone. So you
Yes.
want to aim for 18 minutes, or would you like to reschedule?
No, I would not like to reschedule. We've done that twice already, so. I'm ready to go.
Well, yours.
I'm going to speak quickly. We're going to submit our testimony along with additional materials and some suggested language for changes.
Great.
And as we're seeing how things are going, I will maybe skip some stuff that you'll be able to read because some of it may be similar to what you've already heard. But I am here today. Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to testify on S5, the Affordable Heating Act, and for all your work in trying to create a just energy transition for Vermont. I'm Andrea Stander. I live here in Montpelier, and I'm a longtime member of 350 Vermont. I'm a former board member and a current volunteer on our Just Transition campaign team. Some of you also know me as a former executive director and policy consultant for rural Vermont.
Can I ask you a quick question? Can we assume when we hear from you that you're speaking on behalf of 350?
I am.
Okay.
I am about to say that. I have the honor of speaking to you today as a representative of the membership of 350 Vermont to share our concerns about and suggestions for the AHA. Statewide, we have over 5,000 members. We have 9 community-based membership nodes representing most areas of the state with over 80 volunteers serving on 5 leadership teams. Dozens of these community leaders, many with their own experience and expertise in energy policy, have dedicated hundreds of hours over the last 2 years to understand the issues addressed by this legislation, talk to experts, and participate in forums and community discussions. 350 Vermont is also an active member of the Act on Climate and the Vermont Renews coalitions, and we've been in vigorous conversation with all the other Vermont organizations who are addressing the climate crisis as part of their work. We know it's going to take all of us. So in this testimony, I hope to answer the following questions for you. What does 350 propose as alternative solutions for reducing greenhouse gas emissions from our heating sector? What are 350's concerns about the solutions currently proposed in the AHA? Why does grassroots participation in the creation of public policy matter? Who is 350 and why do we care about the AHA? So for your reference, I'm going to submit the testimony will be submitted with the language and so on and so forth. So real solutions we would like to see. Accelerate the transition away from combusting fuels for heating by focusing on weatherization, installing heat pumps, and helping Vermonters reduce their energy consumption. As we focus on electrification and weatherization, continue the use of current heating fuels rather than cause oil and propane costs to increase as fuel dealers pass costs on to customers, causing new harms without actually reducing emissions. For example, do not bring biofuels or renewable natural gas into Vermont. Emissions reductions from these fuels are minimal or non-existent. Human and ecological impacts are known, destructive, and unjust. Do not allow hydrogen for clean heat credits. Most hydrogen today is made using fossil fuels. Green hydrogen is a limited, precious resource that should only be produced and used on site for heavy industries hardest to decarbonize. Green hydrogen leaks easily and contributes to greenhouse gas warming. Direct the PUC to deny contracts that involve awarding credits for or importing combustible fuels not yet used in Vermont that can cause additional harm to people and ecosystems. Pass the new Renewable Energy Standard Bill. Clean up Vermont's electrical supply so that electrification of heating actually reduces emissions. Pass an electric ratepayer protection provision that helps Vermonters afford their electric bills now and helps them make the choices needed to transition to electrification heating solutions. Instruct the PUC to authorize thermal energy networks in Vermont to enable a pathway for implementing this clean heating solution. What are 350's concerns about the AHA? Biofuels. Last year, when you considered the Clean Heat Standard, 350 Vermont asked you to take the concerns of Vermonters into account by addressing the climate, ecological, social, and economic impacts of biofuels as part of a Clean Heat Standard. As a result, this year's legislation attempts to address this by requiring the methods used to measure greenhouse gas emissions include fugitive emissions, i.e. gas leaks, as appropriate for the pathways of distribution and use in Vermont. We're grateful for this change in the bill. However, we don't see the carbon intensity classifications for biofuels as sufficient for reducing the environmental and economic harms from liquid biofuels and so-called renewable natural gas. There's more work to do. The current version of the AHA contains provisions that do not address the concerns of our members as expressed. These current provisions would allow a further increase in carbon emissions through the production, transportation, storage, and combustion of biofuels, lead to greater ecological destruction of natural systems we all depend on, such as deforestation and the loss of critical agricultural land caused by the production of biofuels instead of growing food here in Vermont and globally. Add more harm to Indigenous, Black, and Brown, and other vulnerable communities here and across the globe who are already bearing the greatest burden from the climate crisis. The AHA strongly incentivizes increasing the use of specific biofuels for heating in Vermont. While some, especially dirty fuel sources, are not allowed, the amount of solid, liquid, or gaseous biofuels is not constrained in this bill. And there are two problems with having no limits on biofuels. The first is the money we will be spending on out-of-state biofuels could be used to permanently lower our energy use and costs by investing in weatherization and energy-efficient heat pumps in Vermont homes and businesses. However, any expenditure on liquid and gaseous biofuels decreases the availability of funds that could be used for energy conservation and efficiency. I gotta take a drink. The second problem with having an AHA that includes biofuels is that the true impacts on greenhouse gas emissions and people's lives and ecosystems are unaccounted for in this bill, and they are devastating. If the methods proposed to estimate them in the AHA were able to account for all the indirect and downstream GHG emissions, all industrially produced biofuels would be recognized as at least as destructive and dangerous as the fossil fuels they are being incentivized to replace. Available liquid biofuels that would be blended with heating oil are derived from agricultural oils and fats that are traded globally. Even used cooking oil is now traded globally. Unfortunately, increasing demand for any agricultural oils drives up the demand for the cheapest oil, palm oil. Our use in Vermont of California or Midwest produced oils will drive up palm oil production in the tropics. There, it causes devastating impacts on greenhouse gas emissions, biodiversity, and indigenous lives through massive deforestation, monocropping, and illegal land grabs. These additional impacts are not accounted for in the AHA, but the increased demand it creates for biofuels will increase the costs of the blended fuel oil incentivized by the AHA. So what about renewable natural gas? Mr. Horwath is going to speak extensively about that. I'm going to limit my comments. As our neighboring states in New York and Massachusetts have discovered, emissions from renewable natural gas processing and pipelines nearly double the GHG emissions of RNG used as a fuel. While the escaping emissions are very difficult to measure because they occur all along the route of long and sometimes buried pipelines, recent efforts have substantially refined these measurements, and the results are alarming. And there's a long list of other impacts on the health of people, soil, and water quality in the vicinity of these facilities and pipelines. Also, ratepayers are being charged a surcharge for the RNG. Other states' regulators have concluded that there is no GHG reduction benefit worthy of the extra costs to consumers. In one of the most egregious giveaways to Vermont gas systems, the AHA has a special protection for RNG. Unlike all other fuels that would count for clean heat credits, RNG does not have to be burned in the state of Vermont to be awarded clean heat credits. This means that the AHA gives Vermont clean heat credit for money spent on RNG production and use well outside of Vermont that is not associated with a reduction of GHG emissions here while increasing emissions elsewhere. What about hydrogen and green hydrogen? I'm just going to say that we're concerned about this. We're very happy that you agreed to hear Professor Howarth. He's an expert in this arena, and I think he will give you a great deal of very, very helpful information, much of which I cover in this testimony. I'm going to skip it right now. In the interest of time, you'll be able to read it and move on. The one thing I do want to say is that the regulatory assistance projects meta review of studies on hydrogen for heating, and we've included a link to this study, compiles 33 peer-reviewed independent studies that dismiss the use of hydrogen for heating. Yet another peer-reviewed study with the same conclusions was released last week, and RAP tweeted about it, and they said, hydrogen for heating is a distraction, inefficient, costly, and resource intensive. This is what all independent studies conclude. New York and Massachusetts are following the science and turning away from hydrogen as a clean heat possibility. It's far too expensive and inefficient to compete with heat pumps. And as I said, the link to that study is in here. I said earlier that green hydrogen should only be used for those really unique situations where nothing else is going to work. Will the AHA create affordability? Low and moderate income Vermonters constitute approximately 64% of our state's population. As a recently retired senior citizen living on a very fixed income, I count myself in that number. I live in a small apartment in a large and very heat leaky Victorian building with 6 other tenants. The entire building is heated by one oil-fired furnace. Although heat is included in our rent, we have no individual control over the heat in our apartments, and we pay for our own electricity. Our landlord is struggling to finance required health and safety improvements. So needed weatherization is pretty low on the list. The bill has been renamed the Affordable Heating Act. Real affordability comes most immediately from reducing energy use through weatherization and energy efficiency. The AHA ensures that 16% of clean heat credits must be from these affordable sources for low and moderate income households. However, to satisfy that 16%, fuel providers are allowed to include all other funding for weatherization and efficiency programs generated outside the mechanisms of the AHA. Therefore, to the extent that the AHA is actually affordable for consumers, its affordability depends on external subsidy programs and is inconsistent with the additionality required of new climate legislation by the Paris Climate Agreement. So why is grassroots participation essential in creating public policy? We believe deeply in the importance of grassroots participation by those who will be affected by the public policy in the creation of that public policy. The AHA is going to affect all Vermonters. Some members of this committee have served in the legislature long enough to experience many of the past grassroots campaigns which resulted in groundbreaking legislation that brought major changes to our state and provided leadership to the entire country, such as marriage equality in 2009, death with dignity in 2013, the GMO right to know labeling law in 2014, and Vermont's first meaningful gun control legislation in 2018. These laws would not have been initiated, let alone passed, without the enormous grassroots support of Vermonters who care deeply about these issues. This is the same kind of issue. So who is 350 Vermont? I'm going to be really fast. To ensure you have an accurate understanding of who 350 Vermont's membership is, it's important to know that 350 Vermont is an independent 501c3 nonprofit organization registered with the state of Vermont. And although we collaborate with 350 International, the organization founded by Bill McKibben, on some national and international issues, we are a separate organization. We follow a distributed leadership model among our small staff, and our campaigns are determined by working with our members. Our mission is to help Vermonters respond to the climate crisis with justice and equity. We work to help Vermonters understand and be fairly represented in energy decisions made by the government and businesses on their behalf. Our members are your constituents. They're not experts, but many of our community leaders have devoted hours, as I said earlier, to trying to understand this very complex issue, help explain it to their neighbors and their friends. And we share a commitment that we do not want Vermont's energy solutions to cause further harm to people and the ecosystems on which we all depend. We must not create solutions that export our pollution or the costs of our energy use to other communities in the US or anywhere around the globe. That is the historic process which has created the climate crisis, now affecting all aspects of our lives. And here's our hope. We, as Vermonters, have a choice. Will you choose to embrace a policy that will keep us all tied to an approach that has been shown in the past to be ineffective? Will you choose a policy that asks low-income, often BIPOC communities outside of our borders to shoulder the burden of our energy use as their farms get turned into pesticide-laden biofuel crops, their water is polluted, by yet another feedlot operation or landfill that generates supposedly renewable natural gas, or whose forests are clear cut to grow even more oils to make biofuels so we can heat our homes? Or will you choose a policy that helps people reduce their energy consumption and energy costs while keeping them warm? A policy that incentivizes energy efficiency and heat powered by the sun, wind, and earth-based temperature via distributed geothermal networks? Will you invest in our communities and a resilient future for all Vermonters, one that does not sacrifice our responsibility as global citizens to resist the continued exploitation of land, ecosystems, and Indigenous communities who have for too long paid the price for our energy choices? Many in Vermont acknowledge that 5 years after it was passed, the Renewable Energy Standard, or RES, needs to be reformed because it includes sources of energy that are still polluting and it de-incentivizes the kind of low emissions renewable energy we truly need. Affordable solar and wind power produced in state that will create jobs, keep our money in Vermont, and truly lower our greenhouse gas emissions. We understand this isn't an easy choice, given the political climate you have to work in. However, it's the right choice to make at this pivotal time, and your constituents ask you to make it. You could do that by keeping biofuels and all hydrogen out of the Affordable Heating Act and making Vermont the state that leads the way in creating a truly clean and just heating future for all who live and work here. Thank you. Take questions if you want to, but I know you have no time.
Well, so Senator, you always have
I
one
didn't even have to use my
question.
FedEx.
I'm okay.
You're okay. Okay.
And I said, this will all be submitted along with some suggested amendment language and some additional materials to back up some things that we have here. And like I said, I skipped the hydrogen section. You're gonna hear about that from Professor Howard. Thanks again for giving us the opportunity.
And we have your written testimony.
It will be submitted just shortly.
Okay.
We were waiting to see whether we actually got to prove it.
So thank you everyone for pushing on. It's always a challenge to hear from many people. Every topic we're talking about today is about bigger than 15 minutes, half an hour, 1 hour, more than bigger than a day. So I appreciate that people have come in. I'd like to take just a 4-minute break because Mr. Howard's connecting remotely from Cornell at 10:15. So
I'll run for coffee for anybody who wants it.
if we can get in and out of the room quickly so that we can pick back up, that would be